So in my book, I'm looking at why countries in Africa that have come out of conflict, major conflict, especially after the year 2000, why they have considerably higher rates of representation of women in parliaments and also in other government positions, and also why they're passing more legislation around women's rights, why they're making more reforms within constitutions compared to countries that have not gone through conflict. And I'm also looking at why it's happened earlier in these post-conflict countries than other countries. Well, the big surprise really was the fact that the countries that came out of these major conflicts, and there's been about 16 of them, had significantly higher rates of representation of women in the parliaments, in the cabinets, and in various other top positions. So, for example, they had twice as many women in the parliament than countries that had not gone through major conflict. And you see the same pattern in Speaker of the House, and so on. All these top positions, you saw the same pattern unfolding in various sectors. You also had in countries like Rwanda has the highest number of percentage of women in the parliament in the world. That's 63%. That's way higher than any other country in the world. And again, I think it's very much tied to the fact that they underwent genocide and conflict in 1994. I don't think it's an accident that Liberia had the first woman elected president in Africa. I think this is again tied to the conflict and an outcome of some of the processes that unfolded after the conflict. Namibia, for example, has got a national gender zebra policy, which is trying to bring 50% of all positions in the state sector, give them to women. And so again, I think this is directly tied to some of the processes that unfolded after the conflict. And I think that what you saw in many countries was, for example, Liberia is a very classic case where you had a peace movement that took place during the end of the conflict, and at the end of the conflict, and it became very clear to the women that if they were going to really have an impact, they had to also have power. So it wasn't just enough to ask for peace and demand peace, but that they had to actually have a seat at the table. They had to be in political power. And so that's why these two issues of peace and power are so closely connected. So one thing that's really clear is that those countries that had women's movements and had autonomous women's movements that were not tied to the government or tied to the ruling party, those countries did much better. And so countries like Uganda, countries like Liberia, where you had these active women's movements, did much better than a country like Angola, where almost all women's mobilization was somehow tied to the state. Same thing, you didn't see very much in Eritrea, very much in Chad in the post-conflict period, and in terms of women's mobilization. And so you, as a consequence, you didn't see many of these kinds of reforms that one saw in countries like Uganda and Liberia. Also, the timing was very important. So you didn't see these same patterns earlier prior to 1990, but especially after 2000, you began to see this very strong pattern between the end of conflict and women's rights advancement. And again, this has to do with the international pressures which began to mount at that time in the mid-1990s, especially around the time of the 1995 UN Conference on Women in Beijing, which is where a platform of action was adopted, which then required that all member states do something about getting women into politics. So this was in the backdrop upon which the domestic women's movements were able to push and use these international pressures to make demands for women's rights. Also, there's a very curious correlation, if you look statistically, at the numbers of deaths. And so the higher the numbers of deaths in a conflict, the more likely you see higher levels of representation of women in parliament and more of these changes. And so what's going on here is that you have more the society is being shaken up, and the numbers of deaths, it's not because the men died, it's because you had a profound shaking up and disruption in society, which then allowed for these processes to unfold. So that's, I think, is what's going on. Well, one of the main things is that there is this silver lining to the end of conflict, that there's a byproduct to conflict in which women's rights are advanced and women's representation and political engagement is advanced. It's not something that one would advocate for, but it's something that we've seen time and again in the post-conflict context in recent years. The other part of it is that if these rights have to be claimed. If women's movements and women's rights activists and women's organizations are not involved in pushing for these changes, they don't happen on their own. So there have to be actors engaged in it.